Good afternoon, all. My name is Thais Danos. I work with sustainability at Febraban, and we are going to have a presentation with Febraban and IFC. Welcome all in this space of learning that we have the pleasure to present to you in this virtual space. The initiative of this webinar is a result of a partnership between Febraban and IFC. We want to contribute with the banking sector in terms of the Paris Agreement. Among the actions proposed, we included some trainings, research, joint researches, and events like this one. An event that we created by selecting some subjects, a potential of high impact in the Brazilian market, and we counted with national or domestic and international experts in these discussions. That is why our subject is distributed generation. Our speakers will introduce the subject and talk about the opportunity this represents to Brazil and for the financial institutions in this country. We are going to talk about the advance of these technologies of distributed generation, mainly the solar energy, which are the possibilities of the markets and how this is presented in the Brazilian market and some future perspectives. I would like to welcome and introduce our speakers today, Bill Gallery and Patrick Doyle. I think that you can see them on the screen. Bill is operation officer in the team of climate finances of IFC, focused on supporting banks and other financial institutions in the area of climate. He works with distributed generation, and also he is an advisor in terms of transactions of distributed generation. He is from United States, and he is graduated by the University of Harvard and also by the Wharton University. And Patrick, he is senior officer at IFC with over 20 years of experience in clean energy and climate changes. He has invested in Latin America, and he's expert in storage in clean energy. He has, before giving the floor to our speakers, I would like to say you something. We are going to have the presentation and then the session of questions and answers at the end of the presentation. And we expect you to send questions to send the questions. You have to be logged in, you have to register and send the question to the comment box. This event will be recorded and will be in the YouTube Febraban channel. I will give the floor. I would like to thank Bill and Patrick for being here with us. Thank you very much. They will speak English and it will be translated into Portuguese. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Thais. I hope you can hear me okay. I want to say again, thank you to Thais. Thank you to Febraban for inviting us to participate in this webinar and for hosting this discussion of this important topic. And thank you to everyone who is listening in today. We hope we can share some useful information that helps you better understand this market and the opportunity that exists for financial institutions in it. I'm going to start just by giving the content of what we're planning on talking about today. I will start off by doing a brief introduction into what we talk about, or what we mean when we talk about distributed generation and why we're talking about it. I'll then give an overview of some of the business models that are present in the market, both in Brazil and globally. I'll then hand it off to Pat, who's going to give an overview of a more in-depth overview of the market, its size, the drivers, the different segments that are out there, with some specific information on the market in Brazil. And then he'll talk about what the specific opportunities are for financial institutions in this space. And then we'll close it out with a couple of case studies, and of course, plenty of time for you all to ask questions, additional questions that you might have. First, I wanted to talk about who we are and who IFC is. Many of you may know this, but for those who don't, IFC is the part of the World Bank Group that focuses on working with the private sector. I think we are probably the largest development institution in the world that has a private sector focus. We have a global footprint, and we work across sort of all parts of the investment and advisory value chain. So we offer debt, equity, trade finance, structured finance, and also various blended finance tools. On the advisory side, we we provide market research, market intelligence. We work with clients to help them develop new business models, new opportunities. We do capacity building. We have a very strong team that does capacity building in the environmental, social, and governance space, and then risk management as well, and as well as numerous other areas, including on distributed generation and distributed solar in particular. Pat and I, as Thais said, sit within the climate finance team in the financial institutions group. Our mandate is to help banks and other financial institutions do more investment in the climate space. And Pat and I specifically focus on the distributed generation and distributed solar sector. So both working with banks and other financial institutions to develop investments in projects, as well as providing advisory support on all the topics we're going to cover today. And obviously, we also have a very strong team within IFC in Brazil that we'd always be happy to connect people to if they have further questions. So let me get into the content of the presentation. First, what is distributed generation? So at a very high level, it's electricity produced on site, generally co-located with the demand, with the consumer, which can be produced from a wide variety of technologies. And so we have some pictures of the main ones here: solar, biogas, biomass, cogeneration from gas plants. There's really a wide range of technologies, also microhydro, that can qualify as distributed generation. Today, we're mostly going to talk about distributed solar, which makes up over 99% of the distributed generation projects in Brazil, and really a very large majority of the distributed generation projects globally. So what is distributed solar? It's basically the same thing. It's a solar system installed directly at a residential, commercial, or industrial site, primarily for consumption on site, although there are some exceptions to that, which we'll talk about a little bit more below. In Brazil, the community solar setup, as well as the remote generation program in Brazil. It can be ground mounted or rooftop mounted. It can be connected to the grid or off grid, and it can come with or without battery storage. So really, it can be a wide range of different setups within that broader distributed solar category. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those in a bit. And sort of the most fundamental point is that it's a growing opportunity to engage with clients in what is a really rapidly growing market. So distributed solar can be a range of different types of projects, a range of different setups. It's a very rapidly growing market, and that's why we're talking about it today. I'm gonna give a very basic overview of the technology. For many people on the call, they may already know some of this, but I just want to make sure that everyone is already or has the same basic understanding of what the technology is and what the different parts of the solar system are. So the first and most important part of this is having a PV panel, a photovoltaic panel that transforms sunlight into DC current or direct current electricity. Then within the system, the inverter transforms that DC current into AC current. This is important because the vast majority of machinery and equipment and appliances runs on AC current. Pretty much everything you have in your house, you have at your office, requires AC current to operate. Any excess power, any surplus power can be exported to the grid if the local regulatory rules allow that. And in Brazil, they generally do. However, in most cases, the solar panels are not going to provide enough power to meet the entire demand on site. So for example, if we're talking about a cloudy day or at night, right, when you're using equipment at night, so the grid or a backup diesel generator will generally provide the rest. Increasingly, you can have battery storage set up along with the solar system that you can charge when the demand on the power demand is low and the solar panels are producing energy. And then when the solar panels aren't producing energy, you can discharge that battery to run your equipment or your appliances or whatever you need. So that's just the basics of what a solar system is. Talking a little bit about the basics of the distributed solar market. And in our mind, we tend to divide it into three different segments or three different markets. The first one of those is the off-grid market. This is relatively uncommon in Brazil, although there certainly are people in this segment. This is for clients who don't have access to the electrical grid and are often using expensive kerosene or diesel generators for their sources of electricity. As I said, it's relatively rare in Brazil, though there is a Brazilian program called Luz para Todos, which is focused on this market segment. The second one here is what we call the bad grid market. This is for people with unreliable grid service, where there are lots of power outages or the quality of the power coming from the grid is not very good, which leaves them dependent on diesel generators to fill some, most, or even almost all of their electricity needs. Again, in Brazil, relatively uncommon, though still somewhat common, or still there are segments of the market where this exists. And the third one is the expensive grid market. And this is really the bulk of the Brazilian market. This is where the regulatory environment and the economics of both power from the grid and of distributed solar mean that distributed solar can compete with power coming from the grid, power coming from the utility. And finally, in the introduction, why are we talking about distributed solar? So first point is that this is a reliable and proven technology, as long as you have the right quality assurance. I think probably many of us have heard stories or have seen experiences with poor quality solar installed at locations. Just actually last month, my neighbor across the street, one of the panels on his roof caught on fire. And this has maybe created a perception in many people's minds that solar is not a reliable technology or it's a dangerous technology. And that is increasingly not the case. I mean, at this point, it is a proven technology deployed in hundreds of thousands or millions of sites across the world. And with the right quality assurance framework in place, it's reliable and increasingly a bankable technology. Second point, solar costs have fallen rapidly. They're already cheaper than the grid in many markets, especially given regulatory support like you have in the Brazilian market. And solar plus battery storage is following an even faster fall, an even faster cost curve. You can see in this chart on the right, this is just updated from the end of last year, showing the weighted average cost of a solar installation globally. And you can see that it's been falling. It was falling fairly rapidly up until the beginning of COVID. You'll see a slight peak in 2021 due to a lot of the supply chain constraints that we all know about that have been caused by the COVID crisis, but should begin to fall again towards the end of this year or early next year as the supply chain bottlenecks ease and new supply of some of the critical components that go into solar PV comes online. These are weighted averages, by the way. Brazil in 2021 is basically right in the middle of the range you see there. I think it's about 86 US cents for a commercial installation, 86 US cents per watt for a commercial installation. So in the middle or even towards the low end of the costs that we see globally. Third point here is that the costs are predictable. And by that, I don't mean that they're predictable. The prices that we see in this chart are predictable going into the future, though generally they have fallen for a long time and we expect them to continue to fall after this sort of COVID bump. What I mean is that the vast majority of the cost of a solar system comes up front. The ongoing operations and maintenance costs are relatively low and pretty predictable. So when you install a solar system at a location, you have a very good sense of what your electricity is going to cost for the next 10, 15, 20 years, depending obviously on the terms of the financing and all that. But it's to say that unlike, say, a fossil fuel technology where the prices of the fuels can fluctuate a lot depending on the global markets, once you've installed the system, you should have a pretty clear sense of what your costs are going to be, which is a huge advantage of the technology that probably doesn't get talked about enough. And all this means that this is an increasingly bankable alternative to grid power, with the potential to eliminate the need for backup generators and to help people reduce their reliance on the electrical grid. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the different business models that are out there to enable the uptake of distributed solar in the market. Apologies for this slide that we were not able to translate this image, but I'll talk through it now, and obviously you'll have access to the presentation later and to the recording later. This slide is focused, so Brazil's regulatory framework allows for a pretty wide range of business models in the distributed solar space. In this slide, we'll focus on that topic from sort of the consumer standpoint, and the next slide we'll talk about from the financing and ownership standpoint. But in terms of who is consuming the power provided by the distributed solar system, Brazil's regulatory framework has a number of options in place. The first one here, which is probably the vast majority of cases and the most straightforward, is just on-site generation. You put a solar system up and the business or the people at the same location are the ones consuming it. The second point here is remote consumption. Similar setup, except the solar panel and the consuming, or the load, the demand, do not have to be in the exact same place. So if it's the same owner within the same concession area, they can have the solar panels at one site and they're consuming the energy at another site. The third and fourth options here, neighborhood solar and community solar, are a bit more complex. They generally involve multiple users, either co-located with the solar panel with the solar system, or not co-located, but just within the same sort of general utility area. And we can talk more about these specific business models if you want, or these specific setups if anyone has any questions, though they are relatively rare. On this slide, I'm talking about the different business models that are out there more from the financing and ownership standpoint. And so, as I mentioned before, most of the cost of a solar system is upfront. And due to that high upfront cost, there are a number of business models out there made to address the consumer financing needs or the customer financing needs. So that's loans, rental contracts, leasing, long-term power purchase agreements. Generally, we've broken these down, or generally these are broken down into two broad models. First, on the left is the CapEx model. The second on the left is the OpEx model, or the DESCO model. DESCO standing for distributed energy service companies, or DESCOs, sometimes called RESCOs in some markets. For the CapEx model, this is kind of just any typical equipment purchase model. Either the customer is going to pay for it upfront in cash, or they're going to finance it through a loan or a financial lease. And the main feature of this is that the consumer is the owner of the system. They're making a capital investment in the solar system. They're responsible for the ongoing O&M and just general maintenance of the system. The benefits to them, one is that this can be cheaper depending on the financing terms you can get. And obviously you're the owner of the asset, which depending on the country or depending on the regulatory environment can have tax benefits. The challenges to this are obviously securing the cash or the financing you need to install it in the first place. And it puts greater responsibility on the consumer in terms of selecting the EPC, the construction company, the solar company they're going to work with, and managing the ongoing operations and maintenance. The OpEx DESCO model, which is increasingly common in pretty much every market in the world where it's allowed anyway. In this model, the ownership is flipped, and ownership stays with the DESCO or the distributed solar energy company that's installing it in the first place. The cost to the customer, in these models, the customer is paying on an ongoing basis, either through a power purchase agreement where they're paying the distributed solar company per unit of power that they're using from the system, or through some sort of rental or leasing arrangement where they're paying more or less a fixed fee per month over the life of the financing. This brings a lot of benefits, obviously, to the customer: much smaller upfront investment, immediate monthly savings on their electricity bill, which is a huge selling point, and one of the reasons this is an increasingly popular model. Predictable long-term costs, and you have this solar company in place that's responsible for all the ongoing operations and maintenance. The main challenge here is picking the DESCO to work with, making sure you have a reliable partner that's going to be around for the life of the contract, which could be anywhere from 10 to 15 years. I'm going to talk briefly about one business model that is not common in Brazil, but I think is an interesting one, especially in markets in sub-Saharan Africa and some places in Asia, and increasingly has applications in Latin America as well. This is called the pay-as-you-go model. It's generally used for financing small-scale off-grid solar systems. And basically what it involves is a small solar system installed with a small deposit on the roof of a customer. And then the customer is prepaying via cash or mobile money for the power they're going to use. They receive in exchange a code via SMS or a scratch card. They then enter that code in the system, and the system turns on for some period of time, sort of like mobile phone credits. Once the prepaid money has expired, the system shuts off, and the customer doesn't have use of the system until they pay again. And this has been an increasingly common way of financing smaller scale off-grid solar systems, as I said, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, generally financed by the distributor itself over a period of 12 to 36 months, and increasingly leading to opportunities for large-scale off-balance sheet financing via SPVs, with the receivables from the customers underpinning the debt provided to these SPVs. And the reason I want to mention it here is it's just an interesting model that we're seeing out there in the world, but also, as I said, we're seeing it not just for distributed solar, but for a range of other applications as well. So companies are increasingly offering this kind of financing for cooking fuel, for appliances, for mobile phones, even for motorbikes and taxis. And so I think there's business models emerging, not just in Africa, but also in Latin America, using the same kind of pay-as-you-go approach that we may be seeing emerging in the next few years. And finally, my last slide before I'll hand it off to Pat, talking about some of the risks that are out there and what the mitigants are for distributed solar in general and for these particular business models. And generally, we divide these into two broad categories, one being off-taker risk, the other performance risk. Off-taker risk being, the likelihood of that the end user is actually going to pay you back and be able to make all the payments on their contracts. This is obviously something that banks and financial institutions are very familiar with, and something you would be well placed to deal with as you're getting into this market segment. Performance risk, however, is when we talk about performance risk, we're talking about the quality and reliability of the technical solution. So the technology itself, the technical side of the business. And because these systems, that distributed solar systems generally last quite a bit of time, like I said, I think anywhere from 10, 15, 20 years or more. And because many of the financing contracts that are out there are also lasting a substantial amount of time, there needs to be some quality control around the technology and around the technical aspects of the system to make sure that it's going to continue to operate reliably, and in turn that the customer is going to continue to want to pay for it. So ensuring quality control is a very important part of this business model. It's one of the sort of very important mitigant that makes it a viable business model for DESCOs and for financial institutions. And we at IFC have been working on developing and soon to be piloting a quality assurance framework that can help banks and others do this. And we'd be happy to talk more about that, obviously, if anyone has any questions on it. But the idea being to help banks and other financial institutions mitigate some of this performance risk and make them more confident in financing these types of projects over the long term. Okay, and that is it for my section. I'm now going to hand it off to Pat, who is going to, as I said, provide an overview of the market and talk a little bit more about the opportunity for financial institutions. Pat?
Thank you, Bill. I'm excited to be here. And I've worked quite a bit on the Brazilian distributed generation market. So we'll talk a little bit about that market in particular, and then we'll try to finish up within 20 minutes or so. So there's plenty of time for questions. On the first slide, we're looking at the market size and the global market size. Solar, in its essence, is the source of all our planet's energy. And as humankind, we're finally getting around to harnessing that, and in the future, it will be the primary source of our energy. I don't think there's much doubt about that. Distributed solar, in particular, which we're talking about, will likely be a large piece of that solar portfolio of energy. As you can see, in the last in the next 5 years, it's predicted to be about half of that. Over the long run, whether it's distributed or large utility scale plants, will depend a lot on how our grid develops and also on battery storage and battery storage technology. You can see in the right these two small charts where Brazil is one of the largest markets for distributed generation at both the residential as well as the commercial level. Also, I wanted to give you a sense of what a gigawatt is, because a lot of the numbers we talk about, and so the Itaipu Dam in southern Brazil is 14 gigawatts. I believe it's one of the largest in the world, if not the largest. So you can see the numbers we're talking about. 300 gigawatts are significant even in comparison to a hydropower project. I think we talked a little bit, Bill covered this topic a little bit, the market drivers and how the upfront cost of finance is really the barrier to renewables versus traditional fossil fuels because of the high upfront cost but low long-term operating costs. So obviously financial institutions need to play a key role in their expansion, and they have. The cost reductions are a big driver, as Bill mentioned, and hopefully that continues. Battery technologies also have been on a rapid decline, and the combination of solar with battery will likely make distributed solar the most economical source of energy at some point in the near future. Regulatory support is key, and that's really what's driven Brazil's market, along with electricity prices. And then the early drivers of distributed solar often were corporations that wanted to purchase solar, produce their own energy, and there's many examples of that. We have some pictures later of L'Oreal, for example, and their efforts both to put as much solar as possible on their roof. L'Oreal in Brazil put as much solar as possible on their roof, but also using the legislation in Brazil to purchase energy offsite to maximize the amount of solar energy that they're purchasing. Go to the next slide. These are examples of the markets, of just sample markets that the IFC works in. Ghana and Nigeria in Africa, two different examples, because in Ghana, it's really higher electricity prices. You have a grid that's reliable, but you're competing with the grid. Whereas in Nigeria, you're competing with small diesel generators, and it's more the off-grid, or what we call bad grid, where people rely on their own generation because the grid is not reliable enough. And then Brazil, of course, as I mentioned, with high electricity prices and very strong regulatory support, is the driver for why it is a global leader in distributed generation. You can go to the next one. This is just giving you examples of different segments of the distributed generation market, and banks obviously have to tailor their products to each segment. Going from the small residential, which is a 10 watt to a 1 watt to 10 kilowatt scale, and then in the various sizes of commercial installations, and then you have the aggregators segment as well, which is at the larger corporates that are purchasing solar, sometimes from utility scale, but in Brazil, the Geração Remota, the remote generation framework. We tried to put a few examples of Brazilian clients that are in this segment at the bottom here. You can go to the next one. As mentioned, Brazil's market has been growing rapidly. It exceeded 3 gigawatts last year, so that's a big hydropower project. And you can see the J curve, as they call it, shooting up, and it will continue to do that this year and next year for sure, and probably slow down a little bit with the new regulations that have been passed, but we don't anticipate that it will significantly stop the growth. If you look at the number of installations, it's largely residential, but because they're small, if you look at the amount of dollars invested or the total capacity, it's about 40% residential, about 40% commercial, and then about 20% offsite remote generation, as mentioned. And that segment is expected to continue to grow fast. Go to the next one. It's been very diverse, the development of the distributed generation market in Brazil. Unfortunately, the colors on these slides don't match. They're from two different sources. So, but you can see on the left that it has been a diverse development of the projects, and that the primary markets are in Minas Gerais is the largest market, and that's because of some particular state incentives in the taxes that the state allows to be generated or used as credits for the projects, but also the large population states, São Paulo and Rio Grande do Sul. You can go to the next slide. Okay, this is a very hot topic in Brazil and has been for years. But now, just a few weeks ago, the new law was actually signed by the president. This is more a slide for you to read later, but I'll try to hit a few of the points without going too in detail, and we can answer some questions. And I believe we can always do a follow-up presentation as well. We have some good reports on this, and some expert lawyers and consultants in Brazil that know these regulations and can help with the risk assessment with any of your particular projects or borrowers that you're looking at. But as I mentioned, it is one of the most generous and most supportive laws for distributed generation in the world. And it allows distributed generation to be up to 5 megawatts. Now that's changing to 3 megawatts, but 3 megawatts is still a very large distributed generation project. It does give you basically full net metering credit. So it gives you credit as if the panel was on your roof, and you're not consuming from the grid, you're consuming from the solar produced on your roof. And in some states, it also exempts you from the tax, the ICMS tax. And that's what I was mentioning with Minas in particular being a large source of projects, because it's a significant portion of the cost. And then as you produce excess credits, you can keep them for up to 5 years. So that's a very beneficial technology. You don't have to use them within the same month or 6 months or year as in many other regimes. So basically you use the grid as a bank or as a battery. You put your credits into the grid, and you get to use them whenever you like, and you don't pay any additional fee for that battery or that bank as the grid. Now the new reforms that were just passed and signed on January 7th will change this somewhat, but there is a portion, but all projects that receive their transmission access or parceria throughout this year, so until the end of 2022, will be grandfathered. So they'll have the same regime for the next until 2045. So almost 23 years from now, they'll still be under the old regime or the current regime. So all those projects you don't have to worry about regulatory risk for. Now, post this year, so in 2023, and during 2023, there's a 12 to 18 month difference in the legislation, but you can just safe to assume, and projects that are built in 2023 will have some changes. Basically, the legislation is designed to more harmonize with what's fair, you could say, but that distributed generation consumers, rather than receive all of the credit for any energy you inject into the grid, you receive a portion of the credit that's associated with generation, but you still have to pay for the costs of the grid. And this regulation was negotiated over a long period of time, but it was an agreement reached between the utilities, the distribution generation companies, and the Distributed Generation Association, Solar Association of Brazil, and of course the utilities, which were the primary drivers for this, and ANEEL. So it will reduce the value of that energy you inject into the grid by somewhere between 20 and 40%. But it will also reduce some of the costs that remote generation faces now. So it's location dependent. But as we said, the market will still be strong post this reform. And it is definitely a sector that we expect to continue to grow in Brazil. There also will be, last bullet is really that you have to pay for your transmission access permits, which will kind of discourage companies from signing up and aggregating many access permits that they never plan to use, that they plan to just resell. So there'll be a significant fee associated with obtaining an access permit. And also you will have to actually build the plant within 12 months. Now that only applies to projects in 2023 and beyond. You can go to the next slide. So the investment opportunities, and we wanted to talk about the investment opportunities for financial institutions. Obviously, we did talk about the barriers being long-term finance, and you obviously can look at two segments here. You can look at lending to the developers or the DG companies or the aggregators of many small projects, and that can either be on their balance sheet or it can be in an SPV. Or a FIDIC structure, or it can be lending to the end consumers. So there are different markets and different products and different risks involved in each of those. And the IFC can help, as we'll talk about a little bit, but with advisory services, as well as with all of the various financial products that we can offer to banks and financial institutions to support them with this market, debt, sub-debt, equity, and risk-sharing facilities or guarantees. Go to the next slide. Our advisory services in particular can help with market research to help you understand the potential opportunity. As Bill mentioned, quality assurance to help you assess the technical risk of the projects. Pipeline development to help you identify potential clients, and then credit risk management to help you understand the unique risks that might be involved with distributed generation. And this really depends on the type of contract and who bears the risk, whether it's the end user or the O&M contractor or the distributed generation company or the aggregator. So the projects are not, the risks are not unique for financial institutions, but the way that the risks are shared amongst different parts of the solar project or different parties that are involved in the solar project is what really makes it a unique market and a place where IFC would be happy to help you assess. You can go to the next slide. Here's a few quick case studies. The first one is a bank in Namibia where we financed, help them issue a green bond that they use to finance distributed generation solar projects. You can go to the next slide. And this is a case of using advisory services to help a bank in Yemen develop a solar lending program, building their capacity, helping them establish a dedicated team, and then piloting specific products. You can go to the next slide. And then this is Sol Fácil. You may know of them, one of the leading fintechs in Brazil, where the IFC made an equity investment last year. They provide residential homeowners loans for solar rooftop projects, so different from the Geração Remota projects. And they also raised about 1.3 billion in debt via a green bond or a green FIDIC last year. You can go to the next slide. That's the end of our presentation, but we're very happy to be here and appreciate your time today. And if you'd like, we can answer questions. Obrigado.
Obrigada, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Bill.
Foram ótimas apresentações sobre o tema.
Excellent presentations. I hope that this has been a good opportunity for the consumers, and because you explained this opportunity for the Brazilian market and for the financial institutions. I follow up the subject since 2011, and I have seen the evolution in the market in terms of the financial sector, mainly in Minas Gerais, as Patrick has mentioned. I am from Minas Gerais also, and it's very good to see this evolution in front of you. This is a strategic sector because the country has green resources, and we know that we have resources thinking on the greenhouse gases, thinking on this climate translations. Before the question session, I would like to announce that we are going to have a second webinar about this subject. And it will be focused on the DG system in the country. So participants, please, you have to pay attention to the dates, and we're going to discuss other subjects. For this debate, we have some questions that we received from the Nunes platform. We have time. If you want to send more questions, you can register very quickly, and you can send the image, the question, sorry. To begin with, one of the interesting points that Bill mentioned at the beginning was the Brazilian program Luz para Todos, the premise of social inclusion. I mean, it is important to think on a fair energy transition. We had the BV example, the Votorantim Bank, that offered funding of over 1,000 solar panels for a poor community with a partnership with an NGO. This was a community in the state of São Paulo. These are examples of models that can be thought and replicated in the financial sector, and how banks can generate other opportunities that are inclusive, other models that can be replicated in terms of DG, based on the examples that you have showed of international experiences. And now let's go to the questions. Could you mention one or two mechanisms that you think the banks can use to identify some of these opportunities in terms of solar funding among your clients' portfolio? So you decide who will respond to the question.
Yes, Bill, feel free to contribute. But I believe the question is focused on amongst your existing clients, how could you identify which ones have the opportunity to install solar? And I think there's, yeah, I mean, the IFC does have a strong advisory services program and has worked with financial institutions for decades on this type of challenge, and we, Bill could talk a little bit more, but that's definitely something we can work with a bank to look at their existing client list, and then if we understand some of the information about their clients' use of energy, their demand for energy, their cost of energy, determine whether there's an opportunity to do more lending to this particular client for clean technologies in general, not just solar. But in Brazil, it's safe to say that that the prices of electricity are high enough and that the regulation is strong enough that if the client has a large facility, it's highly likely that they could cost effectively install it on their roof. And if they don't, it's likely that they could participate in a remote generation scheme that would provide them solar energy for the same or for savings. It does depend quite a bit on the state and the utility that you have in Brazil for how quickly the payback will be. but for a client that's willing to make it a priority and use its balance sheet to borrow direct to implement these measures, it can be very competitive and compelling in Brazil.
Yeah, I wanted to add a couple points here. First would be just to echo what Pat said, which is in Brazil, the economics are getting good enough that I think if you offer a product in this space, your clients will figure it out for themselves and will come to you with interest in the product because it's becoming so widespread. The other 2 points I wanted to make, though, first is this is somewhat of an emerging opportunity or emerging thing that's happening, but there's increasingly use of technology, basically satellite technology, satellite imagery, and automated, let's say, automatic algorithms or AI to assess the potential for solar on rooftops. So our colleagues at the World Bank have been doing a lot of work in this space where they take satellite imagery, they run an analysis on it, say for a city like Sao Paulo, they run an analysis on it, and then they're able to identify, first of all, the total potential for rooftop solar in that city, but also on a given building, what's the potential? And so this is an emerging area, but if it sounds of interest, be happy to talk about it more and see if there's ways to work together on that. But again, just given the economics in Brazil, you might not even need that. I think if you develop a product and offer it to your clients, you'll find that there's a lot of interest and a lot of opportunity there. And the second point I wanted to make is I think something we've seen in other markets, and actually in Brazil as well, is financial institutions partnering directly with solar companies, sort of established solar companies with good reputations, especially on the quality side, and working with them to help identify a pipeline of projects. So if you can identify solar companies you're comfortable working with, they are the experts in developing projects and identifying opportunities, and you sort of lean on their expertise in that area while they're leaning on your expertise in providing financing. And those partnerships have been fruitful in other markets.
Legal, Bill. Essa é uma pergunta também que a gente tem aqui.
This is a question we have here. We still have lack of information or understanding by the market about technologies, and how is it possible to break this information barrier? You talked about these partnerships, joint work, maybe training is important. It's a way to be followed, but you have any experience that you could mention from other countries where it has been possible to break the information barriers so the product becomes more attractive for the consumers?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this first, Pat. And this is something IFC actually has a ton of experience with in the off-grid solar market segment. We have a program called Lighting Global, which for the past decade or so has been working in off-grid solar to build that market sort of across the entire value chain, but with a particular focus on quality assurance and consumer education. And I think that's been a really good example and learning experience for us on how you can design and execute consumer education campaigns to spread information about solar technology, about the reliability of solar technology, about the companies that are out there in the market that customers can go to. And one important lesson we have learned from that is, a decade ago, what is it, 2022, so more than a decade ago, when solar was really first emerging as a distributed technology, as an off-grid technology, there was much more need for this. People, especially in some of the more poorer markets or some of the more remote markets, didn't even understand the basics of the technology and would ask very simple questions like, if I put a solar panel on my roof, will it use up the sun and will the sun go away? And like very, very basic questions. Now, solar technology is pretty much everywhere in the world. Almost any consumer you talk to will know we'll have a basic understanding of the technology, and the challenge is more about explaining the nuances, building confidence in the reliability of the technology, building confidence in the solar companies you're working with. So the need for sort of really basic consumer education is much less. And the type of education you need to do is maybe more targeted, a little bit more like marketing and a little bit less like education as people become more and more familiar with the technology. So I think this is something we've managed to do quite successfully in certain countries in the off-grid sector. There's lessons from that can be applied to the distributed sector, but also just in general, the solar is evolving rapidly. People are getting information just organically through word of mouth. And that's also something we can use to our advantage.
Ótimo, obrigada, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. Other question we have here about how banks can incentivize projects of solar energy without leaving their core mission in terms of profitability and risk management.
Sure, I can start that.
Eu posso começar a responder.
I think that this is not a higher risk sector when you understand the full details of who your borrower is and what the contracts are that are involved for the generation of that solar energy. If you're lending to a SPV and you're basing it on the receivables, it's much like another receivable contract. In Brazil, these remote generation projects can be lower risk than rooftop in some ways, because if a client defaults, you can replace them. But the evidence in other markets of rooftop solar is that the default rates have been extremely low. The risk of the penalty for a client defaulting on a solar project is often they're going to pay much more for their electricity. So it can be a low risk segment to lend to, actually, or a lower risk type of project to lend to. And it doesn't require necessarily any lower interest rate from the financial institution to make the economics work.
Ótimo, Patrick. A gente falou pouquinho, né, da questão de riscos agora.
We have talked about risks. I think that
relacionando com uma outra pergunta que a gente tem aqui, se você puder falar pouquinho sobre.
Can you talk about if it is necessary a new model of financing, or banks can use their traditional contracts? Banks can use their traditional lending contracts. What will be the difference between the energy and energy project from, finance, project finance project?
I'll start, but then Bill, feel free. I mean, typically the challenge for these financial institutions is that it falls between project finance, corporate finance, and leasing. So where exactly, or residential, commercial loans. So there's the projects tend to be, you want to finance them like project finance projects and just rely on the energy generated, but because they're so small, it's very difficult to make them project finance projects. Now in Brazil, we're talking about 5 megawatt projects that it does look much more like a project finance structure, and you can have all the legal and risk structures to finance those directly if it's a large 5 megawatt community solar type of project, the Geração remote projects we're talking about. But if we are talking about a typical consumer finance or residential loan, I think you can use the same. It helps to have investment officers that are educated on the product and specialize in the product to really do these types of loans. But I think you can use your traditional consumer finance products there. The tenor, if you want to pay back the project only with the savings, the tenor of the loan may have to be longer, and that's one of the big challenges. But the IFC also specializes in that, in longer tenor loans and in risk sharing to try to reduce those risks. I don't know if that was clear, but basically, you know, a solar project financed is getting quicker and quicker, but typically a 5-year or 2-year loan is not going to be enough to pay back just with the savings. So you basically are operating a profit from day one. You put zero down and you pay back just with the electricity savings. It can happen, but often you need a longer term loan to do that. If you want to put zero down up front and you want to pay back just with the savings, you may need 8 to 10 year loan. It's getting faster in Brazil, though. I think we're probably at 5 to 6 years.
Ok. Em referência também à questão
regarding financings, DG companies and final users need some financing. In your opinion, what of these profiles will be more risky for the creditor and why? The risk, the greater risk will be for the companies, the DJ companies, or the consumers companies. Sorry, consumers, residential consumers.
First, it depends on the
Depende da estrutura.
Whether it's a rooftop on-site project, as Bill was explaining,
projeto no local com painéis no telhado,
or a remote generation project.
Projeto de geração remota.
The other aspect is, of course, the collateral that you have.
É a garantia que você tem.
So I think that typically banks view
os bancos
lending
consideram emprestar
to a distributed generation company
a uma empresa de distribuição gerada como a consideram de risco mais alto.
Have less capital typically.
Tem menos capital.
Than lending, say, to a corporate who's borrowing on its own balance sheet. But
uma corporação,
the corporate on its own balance sheet may not be interested in using its capacity for that, and would prefer to finance it off their balance sheet with a distributed generation company.
Mas preferimos nós financiar off the balance, fora do balanço.
Borrower,
depende do quem está tomando o
to take that loan
empréstimo.
on their own balance sheet.
Se ele vai colocar esse empréstimo no seu balanço e também na garantia, mas o projeto pode ser estruturado
project finance basis, given the energy is consistent, predictable.
Ou talvez de project finance.
And again, in Brazil, you have
no Brasil,
credits. You know, if you overproduce 1 year, you have
créditos de até
them for 5
ano.
years. So
você pode usá-los por 5 anos.
it's a much less risky proposition than it appears.
Obrigada, Patrick. Acho que a gente está
Obrigada, Patrick.
problema técnico do
Temos
retorno,
Temos um problema técnico.
pouquinho com dificuldade para o Patrick falar. Não sei se já conseguiu
Não.
ver.
I think they say they are having technical problems.
Um minutinho só para a gente se alinhar aqui, para não prejudicar os palestrantes nem os ouvintes aqui do webinar.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's fixed now.
Okay.
Apologies for the...
Não, obrigada pelo esforço da resposta. A gente percebeu que estava com alguma dificuldade. Mas acho que também deu para entender a mensagem. Obrigada, Patrick. Bem,
Did you want me to review that or?
Eu não sei só como que só um minutinho, deixa eu só perguntar aqui como é que saiu para o pessoal que está ouvindo, se eles conseguiram ouvir a tradução. Só conseguir me confirmar aqui, por favor. Patrick, se você puder repetir novamente, só para a gente confirmar aqui a tradução.
Could you repeat your answer, please, of the last question? Could you please do it?
Yes, Bill, do you want to add anything there or continue or kind of paraphrase what I said?
Why don't you go ahead and I'll add on at the end.
Obrigada.
Okay, so we were talking about whether it's more risky to lend to a project developer or DG company or lend to a residential or commercial or industrial consumer. And obviously, as the financial institutions in attendance know, it depends a lot on the collateral and the type of project, whether it is on a roof or it's a remote project. And they each have their own risks. But I would say that because these projects basically pay for themselves, because they reduce costs, they tend to be lower risk loans than a typical loan for corporate expansion or a new business line. So even if you are lending to an SPV, if it's a project finance structure, the challenge then is to assess the credit risk sufficiently and have enough coverage or collateral that if you have some defaults, they will still be able to pay back the loan. And this is something that we've worked quite a bit with, and I know your institutions have a lot of expertise in. So I would say that overall, I would think it's a lower risk type of loan than other types of loans.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add on here is that in many markets, we see banks doing both. So, obviously the advantage of one of the advantages anyway, of lending to the distributed solar companies is that you don't have to identify individual projects or clients yourself. And if it's a good company, they're going to be very efficient at generating projects. These are relatively small loans that you're doing. So being able to do it through a distributed solar company is going to tend to be more efficient. And so the one example I would point to is a bank called UOB out of Singapore. They have a program called U Solar operating in 4 or 5 countries now, and they're basically offering both. So they partner with a relatively small number of distributed solar companies, some of whom are financing the projects directly through the company, some of whom offer customers an opportunity to finance it themselves through UOB. But they use sort of a uniform or a single platform to do this. So basically, whatever the preference of the customer is and whatever the business model of the companies they want to work with is, they have a product available for them to fill that need. And then at the same time, they're also providing working capital and sort of other financing behind the scenes to the companies themselves. And that way they're allowing themselves to cover sort of the entire market. And so I think, as I said a little while ago, the key issue here is identifying companies you're comfortable working with. But if you can do that, there may be an opportunity to do both, really.
Ótimo, obrigada, Patrick, pela repetição da pergunta.
Thank you, Patrick, for repeating your answer. We have a question, so we can hear from the experience you have in other markets. Could you please give examples of one of the inputs that the framework that IFC is developing to assess banks or have access to the projects in order to be funded?
Yeah, I think this is a question about the inputs that go into the quality assurance framework that we've been developing.
Los inputs da estructura que estamos.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm hearing the translation again. But just could you confirm the question is about what inputs are going into the quality assurance framework that you might work with a bank to put in place?
Sim, você pode exemplificar dos inputs.
I think that's right, Bill. I think that's what they were referring to.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, so there's varying levels of complexity here, or you can get as simple or as complex as you want. But the sort of what we have done in other markets and what we're working on now is assessing the performance or the practices of solar companies kind of from beginning to end of the project. So that includes the procurement or the quality of the components they're using in their projects, panels, inverters, everything. It includes the process they use to design a project, and in particular, whether the individuals doing design and installation are trained and certified to a certain standard. It includes the practices they use in installation and in operations and maintenance of the project. And then potentially, if you have a company that has enough of a track record, you can also just look at the performance of their existing projects. So if there's data available on projects they've already installed, that can be the best indicator for you on quality assurance, because you have a healthy track record to look at. The challenge with many companies is because this is a relatively new market, they may not have that many projects that have been installed for several years and have been running for several years, and that we have a lot of data on. And in that case, you need to look at the components, you need to look at the training and certification of their staff, and you need to look at the practices they're following in design and installation and maintenance of projects.
Yeah, I would just say that the technical risks in solar tend to be much lower than other technologies. So, you have a small fraction of projects in general that have some problem with their installation. You generally have to assume a slightly less, a slightly lower amount of radiation or production than maybe was predicted initially, but the tools take that into account. A good solar developer won't oversell the customer and promise much more generation than they actually know can be realized. And in Brazil, the models have been accurate, actually, compared to some other parts of the world for what the expected production was over the last 5 to 10 years. So all depends on how much sunlight you get, and of course, if someone doesn't account for shading of the building next door or something like that. But I think overall the technical risks are much lower than in other types of projects.
Ótimo, Patrick, você já entrou
Thank you, Patrick. Now you have answered the next question that is focused on investment on the Brazilian market, but thinking on the future at medium and long term, which will be the role of the financial sector in the evolution of this energy, so that we have a sustainable project in the next years. How you see those scenarios?
I'll say quick words, Bill, but feel free. I think really, I mean, providing that long-term and as low cost finance as possible is critical to these technologies continuing to be utilized, and banks really getting educated on the technology themselves. And when Brazil right now will still have very generous regulation in the future, but the next step will be, if I'm not injecting the excess energy into the grid and getting 100% credit for it, well, I can put a battery on in my own building, and then I'll store my own energy, and I'll get 100% credit, right? So the battery technology, as it becomes economical, is really the next frontier that's going to make this market grow.
Yeah, I mean, as Patrick was saying earlier, we expect the Brazilian market to keep growing pretty rapidly, even with these regulatory changes. I think there's going to be healthy growth in the future. That said, I think probably the next 2 years are going to see really rapid growth. I mean, 2021 exceeded expectations. And I think 2022 and 2023 would also look to be very strong given the general state of the market in distributed solar and those regulatory changes. And so I would just say that there is sort of an immediate opportunity to be doing more in the space, and also a huge need in the market, because there's going to be a lot of people wanting to install distributed solar, and that financing needs to come from somewhere. And so just given the immediate sort of prospects of the market, I think I would say there's going to be a really big opportunity in the short term for financial institutions.
I wanted to add one more thing, and that's unfortunate for Brazilians, but electricity prices have gone up almost 100% over the last 9 to 10 years, as you probably know, and it doesn't look like that's going to slow down. So despite you may be receiving 20 or 30% less compensation from the grid for energy that you inject. Now, energy you use yourself, you're still getting 100%, but energy you inject, well, if electricity prices still go up at 6% a year, that pretty soon is overwhelmed, as well as the capital costs coming down. So I would expect this is a market worth focusing on. It's going to continue to grow in Brazil.
Isso mesmo, Patrick, é a nossa expectativa realmente.
You're right. Our expectation is that financial institutions will perform an important role in this scenario. You have made comments now. We have received other questions that we are going to address on the last live session that will be focused on the Brazilian scenario mainly, and we will count with technical support and IFC as our partner in the building of the content and an advisory about the about the subjects we are addressing. I would like to thank Patrick and Bill, their presence in this webinar. And I would like to make some comments. Would you like to make some comments before ending the session, Patrick and Bill?
No, I just really want to thank our partners at Febraban for setting this up, and it's a great pleasure to speak with you. And yeah, we hope we're all in person again soon.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And obviously, as we said, we're available if anyone has any further questions or would like to discuss this topic further. Please feel free to reach out.
Obrigada novamente.
Thank you again. Thank you, Patricia, our translator, the Febraban's team that is helping us to organize the events. And I would like to remind you that after the live transmissions, all people interested, we have a free access through the YouTube Febraban's channel. We will have other webinars, and we will count with your participation. Thank you, and see you again.